Welcome to our very last webinar from the series titled The New Media Between Science and Fiction. And science it is today, as we will listen to a presentation about a certain research. May I welcome our speaker, Dr. Ahmer Arif, Assistant Professor at the University of Texas at Austin from the School of Information. He holds a PhD in Human-Centered Design and Engineering from the University of Washington. And his research falls at the intersection of computer science and social science. It is situated within the fields of human-computer interaction and computer-supported cooperative work. He currently studies how people use communication technologies like social media to spread, shape, and confront disinformation and misinformation. So we will have a nuanced and in-depth look into disinformation campaigns. And today we will work in the following way. Our speaker will have his presentation for approximately 40-45 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. To make the most of the Q&A session, we will invite you to prepare and ask your questions during the presentations. Since the speaker doesn't see the chat box as he speaks, we will invite you to Google Jamboard to ask your questions there. So let me walk you quickly through how the Jamboard works. You can see the link to the Jamboard in the chat box, and I will share the screen to show the example of it. So this is the screen, maybe a little bit too big. Let me zoom out of it, and yeah. So you just, in the left, on the left side, you can see options to edit that Jamboard. You can use either notes to type your question. And once you type it, it appears on the screen. You can see the yellow screen right now, but you can also use like a text box. This is the second last from the bottom, the second option. And you just type your question without any fancy colors, and once it's typed, you can see that it's here with us. I can therefore, after you post, you put your questions here, I can arrange. Yeah, exactly. Pink is great. I can arrange the questions so that we see certain blocks that appear. Let me know in the chat if you have any problems with the Jamboard, or simply type your questions in the chat too. I will copy paste them to the Jamboard so we can, we and our speaker can also see the questions that appear. So yeah, welcome again to our webinar, and without further ado, to you, Ahmer.
All right. Thank you, Anna, for setting this up and for setting up the Jamboard, by the way. It's a really, I find it's a really good way to give speakers agency on what questions they can pick and choose and how to answer. So thanks for setting that up. All right, let's get this rolling. Let me share my screen. So you guys should be seeing just the slide right now.
Yeah, right, it's perfect. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. All right, so good morning / afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thanks for having me here. My name is Ahmer, and today we're going to be talking about disinformation on social media. Now, I've titled my talk Troubling Matters because the research we're going to be talking about looks at mis and disinformation in the context of disturbing times, right? Periods of collective stress and uncertainty that can disrupt normal social routines, like crisis situations and large-scale political protests. I also find the word trouble interesting because it derives from a French word meaning to stir up, to make cloudy, to disturb, and that bears some connection to disinformation, I think. And finally, for me, the word trouble here is a nod to the title of a book I really love by Donna Haraway. In the book, Haraway argues for the value of a kind of thinking that comes from learning to live with uncertainty in an imperfect world. That's been a very significant theme for me in this research. Now, over the last couple of years, we've all been introduced to a variety of terms, right, to describe some of the toxicities in our information environment. In the interest of helping you listen, I'm going to focus on a subsection of this problem and on one of these terms in particular, disinformation campaigns. And I'm going to talk about these in the context that I've been studying them, which is online, during crisis events, and political disruption. My overriding goal for the talk portion of this webinar is to help add nuance to our understanding of what disinformation campaigns are and how they work. So I'll define the term and situate it in some historical context. I'll share some of my empirical research that explores how these campaigns work. And because I want to prioritize having conversations with you all, I'm going to set aside about 25 to 30 minutes for Q&A. I've organized this talk to highlight 4 misconceptions that this research is helping to undo. I'd like you to listen for them because in my experience, they're surprisingly common and leave many decision makers vulnerable to manipulation online. And even if these might seem familiar, it can be helpful to have them named and attached to empirical data like I'm going to do. And spoiler alert, I'm going to name them for you upfront. They are that disinformation is a binary or black and white problem, that its aim is to convince people to hold a particular position or ideology, that it's mostly propagated by bots and trolls, and my favorite one, that it only works on those other uncritical people. All right, so let's start unpacking all this by laying down some terms. Disinformation campaigns are organized communicative activities that aim to reach large groups of people. And objectively, this isn't that different from other information campaigns, like advertising. But the term disinformation tends to carry pejorative connotations, right? And to help us understand why, we can contrast it with the term misinformation. Misinformation refers to information that can be unintentionally misleading, things like rumors and gossip, which emerge from natural human behaviors and have a function in our societies. Disinformation, on the other hand, refers to information that is deliberately false or misleading, such as hoaxes. So on one level, the difference is one of intent, but we don't always problematize even deception, right? Since it can be used for benevolent aims, like lying about a surprise birthday party. But colloquially, we associate disinformation with malicious intent. And one cultural reason for this might be that the term has historical connections to what Soviet intelligence in the 1950s called disinformatsiya, a kind of information campaign based on techniques that go beyond simple deception. Because of their clandestine nature, there isn't a lot of academic literature on these techniques. My understanding is informed by the writings of Ladislav Bittman, a Czech intelligence officer who was a practitioner of disinformation and who defected to the US in 1968, eventually becoming a professor of disinformation studies. His work helps constrain the idea of disinformation to coordinated state efforts that seek to manipulate information spaces to achieve strategic political objectives. And this constraint begins to bracket out things like advertising. You know, that said, we no longer have to rely on the word of ex-intelligence professionals, right? While social media platforms are facilitating new forms of disinformation, they're also providing new ways to study them. The activities occurring on these platforms leave behind digital traces, like tweets, right? Which I use to study disinformation campaigns after the fact and at scale. I also want to really quickly note that not all disinformation, historical or modern, is connected to Russia, right? The researchable opportunities this work was built on does happen to involve the country, but this is a topic with global dimensions, right? This map here, for instance, shows the results of a 2018 inventory. Researchers found evidence of government and military teams engaged in social media manipulation in 48 countries, up from 28 the year prior. And how we choose to respond to such developments has important ramifications. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Singapore are pushing for tighter controls over media content. And here in the US, we see educators moving to develop courses like calling BS at the University of Washington, and controversial efforts by tech companies like Facebook to flag fake news. And nobody seems entirely happy with these solutions. And this spirit of interventionism and debate around this topic has motivated research in many fields now to explore how we can address disinformation. And a persistent challenge there has been understanding the role that the online crowd of journalists, activists, and ordinary people can play in these campaigns. We're going to be paying close attention to this intersection. We're going to examine how state-affiliated actors exploit the sense-making efforts of online crowds to spread disinformation, and especially how they invite their audiences to approach the information landscape around them through a lens of suspicion. And this connects to today's theme of critical thinking and to larger questions of how we might confront disinformation campaigns with more solidarity as researchers, educators, and designers. Now, to pay attention to this intersection, we're going to be looking at some empirical research, but I'm going to skip over a lot of the methodological details today. I'd be happy to talk about these if people are interested in Q&A, but for now, I think it's enough to say that we'll be looking at some social media data. What I will say is that I apply different funds of knowledge, skills, and experiences to interpret this data. I want to quickly share 3 things about myself that show up in this work to different degrees. First, I bring a particular cultural understanding to my data. Growing up in Pakistan under a military dictatorship has helped me become more attuned to what it's like to exist in a society that has a deeply dysfunctional relationship with institutions like academia and journalism, and where conspiracy theorizing has become both a means of coping with and maintaining the status quo. And this background has also made me kind of more sensitive to colonizing tendencies whenever we talk about using technological innovation to solve complex global issues like fake news. I've also seen people migrate towards extremist positions. This helps me understand how social alienation can motivate a person to develop a different position on what counts as valid knowledge and use that to find inconsistencies in news coverage. And this has guided my imagination whenever I think about what accurate information or critical thinking even is when our technologies expose us to our moral and epistemic differences. And last but not least, you'll probably see that I'm the product of multiple education systems, right? An R1 graduate education in human-centered design, but before that, a liberal arts education, one that combined a training in computer science with a deep love of English literature and the humanities. All right, so now I'm going to jump into the research. Some of the things I'm about to share may seem familiar because they pertain to topics that have had coverage in the media. A portion of that coverage, such as in The Atlantic, The Guardian, and Mother Jones, built on this research that I'm sharing with you now. And just to be clear, these are multi-year, multi-paper projects. I'll try to give you a good amount of depth here, but if you want more technical details, we can get into those in the Q&A. All right, so in 2016, I was working with an undergraduate student named Leo, who wanted to study a contentious issue he was very concerned about, the Black Lives Matter movement and some tragic shooting events that took place that year. We had collected a large number of tweets and were using them to make visualizations like the one you see here. This is a retweet network graph in which the nodes or little dots are Twitter accounts, and 2 dots are connected by a line if at least one of them has retweeted the other, which helps us see the way information spreads over the network. Here's the graph with the lines hidden, so you can see the individual dots more clearly. The dots that are closer together are social media accounts that retweeted each other more. And if I had more time, I could tell you about how Leo and I spent over a year analyzing this information space. But suffice to say, we did enough work to be reasonably certain that the two large clusters you see here were divided both along political lines and their general stance on Black Lives Matter. The cluster of accounts on the left side of the graph tended to express support for politicians like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, and they were protesting police brutality against African Americans. The cluster on the right shows reactionary counter movements that were attempting to problematize this, and they tended to express support for Donald Trump and the right to own guns. We published a paper with a much more nuanced account of all this, and at the time, I was really happy because the student I was mentoring got to be first author on that paper, right? It was a win, yay. But just 2 weeks after that publication went out, the US Congressional Intelligence Committee put out a list of social media accounts given to them by Twitter. Accounts that were suspended for being associated with an organization interfering in US politics. That's based in St. Petersburg, in Russia, and is called the Internet Research Agency, and which I'll call the agency to save myself some words here on out. The agency has been described as a troll farm that spreads online propaganda to further the Kremlin's agenda in a variety of countries, ranging from France, Ukraine, the UK, the US, and Russia itself. When we saw the accounts that were suspended, we recognized some of them. We had even quoted 2 of them in our first paper, which made us want to go deeper. So we started a new study by cross-referencing the list with the full data set and found dozens of agency accounts in the data. And some were amongst the most retweeted accounts, which made us go take another look at this. Now I'm going to highlight the agency accounts and their retweets in orange. Doing that reveals 2 distinct groups embedded in both clusters, meaning that the agency circulated content on both sides of this conversation. Now, this might not be as surprising to some of you now, but it was very provocative for me back then in 2016. It began to deconstruct certain binaries in my thinking, which made me both appreciate it and find it unsettling. Now we can see there's very little overlap between these 2 groups. So it stands to reason that whatever they were doing was probably different in some ways. To learn about that, I analyzed the content these accounts produced. I analyzed their tweets, their profiles, what domains they linked to, the news stories they shared, and traces of their activities on other platforms. I also used the Internet Wayback Machine to scrape deleted content, since social media companies had removed everything linked to these accounts. Now, in presenting what this surfaced, I have to acknowledge that election interference remains a prominent topic on our cultural radar here in the US. So let me start by pointing out that all the agency accounts converged to amplify certain strategic messages about the 2016 US election. In the politically right-leaning cluster, all the agency accounts impersonated conservative US citizens and political groups, and they spread memes supporting then Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. And in the politically left-leaning cluster, all the agency accounts pretended to be activists and organizations who supported Black Lives Matter. And one of the things they did was promote skepticism against Hillary Clinton by emphasizing her as a white candidate who didn't represent the interests of African Americans. Now, this is important, but I also want to share something else that really struck me when I first looked at the data, which is that these accounts were not just mechanistically blasting out information that was inaccurate. A lot of their communication wasn't even amenable to fact-checking because it was about reaffirming values. In the left-leaning cluster, for example, agency accounts tweeted to celebrate things like Black History Month, African American women's hairstyles, and movies like Hidden Figures and Black Panther, which featured African Americans playing prominent roles. And the right-leaning cluster, the agency accounts made it a point to celebrate traditional American things like the flag, Thanksgiving, Easter, and Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. Now, on a slide like this, these messages can seem banal, But in context, on Twitter, they bring these accounts to life by making them feel much more spontaneous, and more importantly, by connecting with our personal experiences and shared cultural narratives. In effect, I think these messages begin to say, we are just like you. And I think that's a powerful message, right? Because it points less to quick manipulation and more to this idea of cultivation. Cultivation in the sense of taking time to build trust and grow an audience, integrating into our information streams more organically, which can feel altogether more personal than, say, gaming an algorithm with some bots to get a hashtag trending. Let me try to unpack this for you using an example that stood out for me personally. This screenshot is from a Twitter timeline that shows 3 accounts in the politically left-leaning cluster. 2 are promoting the 2017 Women's March, and the third is retweeting them. In practice, this looks like an event being publicized by a clique of online activists. But here, all 3 activists were probably just one person or a couple of coworkers sitting in some office in St. Petersburg. But there's something else I value in this example. When I looked at these tweets, I immediately feel this creeping sense of doubt and confusion. Part of my brain starts going, wait, how is this wrong? Supporting the Women's March isn't problematic. That's a good thing, right? Is Twitter really sure about these being propaganda accounts? Why should I trust them? And who gets to decide what propaganda is? That's my reaction. You can have a different one. But I share it right now to remind us that unverified or false news is one thing, but this type of content also really affects us, right? When disinformation campaigns connect with our worldviews, problematizing them suddenly becomes a lot more challenging. Challenging for social media companies to regulate, but also for us as researchers, educators, and as individuals, because it can muddle our thinking. And this starts to align with a theory about disinformation, theory with a little d, if you will, that muddled thinking and confusion might be the point. That one goal campaigns can have isn't about convincing people of anything, so much as it is about suspending them in a state of doubt and division. And doing this involves destabilizing the relations different publics have with each other and with social institutions like the press. Now take a look at this. In the left-leaning cluster, agency accounts consistently equated long-standing media institutions with tools of oppression. And on the right, the agency accounts were openly warning their audiences that, and I quote, that propaganda is everywhere. Propaganda coming from media outlets that are the corrupt and partisan mouthpieces of a global elite. And more relevant here, these accounts insisted that the entire Black Lives Matter movement was, and again, I quote, a race-baiting mainstream media narrative invented by George Soros. And while we're on the contentious subject of race baiting, take a look at this. These are some representative accounts from the left-leaning cluster, and these are some from the right. Now, I shared just a little bit about how these accounts cultivated personas through their content and coordination, but just this dichotomy of images begins to say a few things, right? For instance, it speaks to digital marketing practices like micro-targeting or brand Bibles. But on a more visceral level, I think we can acknowledge this dichotomy is also tapping into existing stereotypes, which other forms of media can contribute to, but social media can bring to life in new ways by making them much more interactive. All right, just to pause and recap, I've talked about how the agency accounts were on both sides of this polarized conversation, as well as this idea of cultivation and fostering antagonism. In the larger picture, this work describes some of the tactics used by the Internet Research Agency. Now, I want to touch on some of the implications of these tactics. For one, this work systematically helps show that disinformation is not simply false information, right? And this is interesting because an approach that's often suggested to tackle this issue of disinformation relies on reductively classifying information as accurate or inaccurate. But the process of disinforming actually relies on layering true information with false, like mislabeling a real photograph. So this work suggests that verifying a specific piece of content, like a particular tweet or link or article, is less important than seeing how it fits into a larger coordinated effort. Another misconception is that the messages being promoted by a campaign are the same as its goals. They can be, but they can also matter less than we might think. For example, I don't think the agency was trying to promote the Women's March. In fact, depending on one's worldview and understanding of power, this type of content might not even seem particularly problematic. I'm going to return to this finding later on, because in it, I think we can catch an uncomfortable glimpse of how the act of critiquing powerful actors can be strategically perverted. One approach, by the way, that's been suggested to work around this involves the criteria of authenticity, which can be defined as whether an account is who it pretends to be and whether it really believes the content it is sharing. The idea goes that if we can identify and weed out inauthentic actors, then we can build a healthier information environment. And I think such approaches have some merit, but they also come with limitations. This next project, which I'm going to talk about, helps show how these limitations can play out in the context of a more sophisticated disinformation campaign. Now, I just gave you a relatively cut and dry account of what appears to be a highly orchestrated campaign. This is partially because Twitter released a list of account names associated with the agency. But the next information space I'll discuss gets murkier. To talk about misconceptions 3 and 4, we're going to look at disinformation during armed conflict, specifically at online discourse related to the Syrian civil war, which is an ongoing conflict that began in 2011 after the Arab Spring protests against the Syrian regime turned violent. And this descended into a multi-sided internationalized conflict. Within this war zone, a group of local volunteers called the White Helmets came together to serve as emergency first responders in rebel-held areas, attending to civilian needs in the aftermath of airstrikes conducted by the Syrian government and their ally Russia. In 2016, the group was featured in an Oscar-winning documentary and nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Through their work, the group also drew the attention of Western audiences to the plight of the Syrian people. For example, they often wore GoPro cameras during rescue operations, which allowed them to corroborate witness testimony concerning atrocities like the Russian and Syrian government bombing campaigns and their use of chemical munitions. And this potentially mobilized a protracted effort to discredit the White Helmets. We collected tweets mentioning the group between June 2017 and June 2018. Some of that content spotlighted the group's work of rescuing civilians and hailed them as heroes. But in many ways, this content was drowned out by narratives that were critical of the White Helmets. These included things like accusing the group of being terrorists, organ traders, child smugglers, and claiming that their positive image was largely a propaganda construct of Western governments. Now, to concentrate on the larger arc of today's webinar, I'm going to skip over the details of the empirical analysis and just focus on some key takeaways. Basically, we paid attention to who was sharing pro and anti-White Helmets content and what articles and websites they were linking to. That is, we took an ecosystem perspective. When looking at the social media accounts amplifying anti-White Helmets content, the top influencers turn out to be journalists that consistently produce content aligning with the interests of Syrian and Russian government officials. Despite looking for them, very few accounts were what you would think of as bots or paid trolls. Many of the accounts amplifying these influential journalists were sincere grassroots activists, as far as we could tell. A lot of them self-identified as anti-imperialists or as anti-war activists. For example, some of them were critical of US foreign policy with respect to Israel and Palestine. For me, they were real, relatable people. Say a grandmother from Australia who's into gardening. Now, when we paid attention to what websites these accounts were linking to, one thing we found was that the Russian government's media apparatus was integrated into this ecosystem. For example, Russia Today and Sputnik were among the top 10 most linked websites in our data set. These websites play a very active role in shaping the anti-white helmets content that we studied. For example, they give the influential journalists in this network a platform and engage in a sort of cross-promotion between them. What this can look like in practice is that RT posts an interview with one journalist, another journalist publishes an article about the interview, which itself gets tweeted out and quoted in other articles that the first journalist then comments on. And this helps to create the impression that the underlying content is really varied. But in reality, it's mostly a small set of actors just echoing each other. And this next set of websites plays an important role in building off of that. They position themselves as alternative grassroots news media. But my colleagues and I argue that they function essentially like gray propaganda sites. They consistently repeat the same messages we see on RT and Sputnik, sometimes copy-pasting the exact same article, and sometimes remixing them slightly for different audiences. And this helps the campaign engage existing online communities invested in different causes to participate in spreading certain narratives. Narratives that might not convince anyone that the white helmets are terrorists, but do create uncertainty about the group. And stepping back, compared to the previous study we just reviewed, the disinformation here is much harder to isolate and see, because it's not just one group of actors in a building somewhere tweeting out with fake personas. Instead, it consists of a lot of independent contributions being made by different types of actors. We often, here in the US, think that disinformation mainly stems from automated and paid actors like bots and trolls. These tend to get the most media and research attention. But effective disinformation campaigns involve a diffuse network of actors, including journalists, think tanks, information activists, and ordinary citizens. And these participatory dynamics obstruct and reduce the practical value of trying to determine authenticity. This research shows that disinformation campaigns don't necessarily have to follow this top-down model of transmitting problematic content. Instead, it suggests that campaigns can utilize bottom-up approaches that rely on persuading audiences to become unwitting agents or citizen marketers. All right, now I'm going to talk about the last misconception. And that involves turning to the question of how these campaigns promote suspicion. Suspicion can be understood as a complex emotion, right? Composed out of fear, anger, curiosity, and a kind of repugnance. It primes us to be alert and to watch out for lurking dangers. And because of that, perhaps it's oriented towards the bad rather than the good. It encourages us to second guess and presume the worst about the motives of others, with or without good cause. And I think suspicion is an important element of both the disinformation campaigns that I've shown you today. For example, the websites I just described in my previous study sought to discredit the white helmets not only by spreading false narratives, but really also by encouraging their readers to look behind the group for its hidden causes and noxious motives. They invite audiences to be critical consumers of information in some ways. For instance, they run events like Fake News Week to, as they see it, inform readers about the deliberate lies told by commercially controlled media. They tell readers to question more, essentially encouraging them to dig into the facts and try to make further sense out of them. They draw on sophisticated critiques of institutions and power structures to give their messages about the white helmets more legitimacy. For example, they tell readers about Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model and try to educate them about topics like gaslighting and US foreign policy fiascos. And some of these messages resonate emotionally, right? As researchers engaging with this content, my team and I felt this was one of the most difficult and disorienting aspects of our work. Those of us who came from decolonized countries especially felt conflicted, I think, because we already had a different relationship to the institutions being critiqued, like Western journalism and nonprofits. Sometimes suspicion is warranted. We often think that disinformation targets only the unsavvy or the uninformed, that it only works on other people. But what I'm trying to show you here is how disinformation can speak to a spirit of disenchantment, a desire to demystify hidden truths and to build a more just world. Understanding this rhetoric and what it taps into can help us conduct more socially responsible interventions in this area. For example, when an overdose of suspicion is part of the problem, it's not so clear that developing more tools to help people be critical of information is necessarily the only path forward. In my work, I've been deeply exploring this idea that disinformation campaigns ask audiences to be critical in much the same ways that we can encourage in other settings, like higher education. And several academics have been converging around this point. The works of Bruno Latour and Rita Felski are particularly fruitful resources in thinking about this, I feel. These authors have written about critique as we teach it in academia, not to deconstruct it, but to describe its limits and to invite us to look for ways that go beyond those limits. In the time I have left with you, I can't do justice to the subtle arguments offered by these scholars, but I want to pull forward just one property of critique that they've described and use it to offer something for us to think about. Critique or critical thinking as a way of reading and engaging with information draws on different histories of suspicion. For example, it draws on the histories of suspicion amongst disenfranchised people. Think of how social movements critique institutions to invite new ways of thinking about them. Similarly, there are histories of philosophical suspicion. For example, think of how critical theories associated with feminism have helped challenge histories of domination. In her work, Felski argues that these and other various strands of suspicion imbue critique and critical thinking with this ethical promise of opposing injustice. This means that when we invoke or participate in critique, we can feel a certain confidence or reassurance that we're engaged in a marginal, oppositional, radical practice, whether it's justified or not. Any questioning of this risks being automatically equated with, the stench of being uncritical and this kind of meek acquiescence towards the status quo. Now, let me connect this idea to some data. You've already seen this example of how the Internet Research Agency invoked critique to foster suspicion of traditional media in a way that's linked to progressive causes. Similarly, here are some quotes from how 21st Century Wire, one of the most cited websites in the White Helmets dataset, describes itself. These quotes illustrate how these websites assume a stance of being oppositional and radical, and invite audiences to partake in that spirit. More broadly, these examples help show how the invitation to critique is prominent in the messages promoted by disinformation campaigns. Invoking critique grants these campaigns an immediately recognizable claim to serious thought. It also shields them because tacitly linking to these larger histories of suspicion helps them lay claim to a sort of moral and political high ground. In my work, I've noted some limitations of critiquing information as a response to these dynamics. By this, I'm referring to interventions based on fact-checking and questioning sources, which I see as exercises of critique that encourage suspicion of information. Such responses have value, definitely, but when they go up against sophisticated efforts to misinform, like the ones we've been talking about today, they also risk clashing with these extensive histories of suspicion. They can risk contributing to or be perceived as contributing to oppressive social forces. And that has real weight given the participatory dynamics of disinformation. I also think more broadly that there's something weirdly recursive and self-canceling about trying to critique disinformation campaigns that are encouraging us to critique. To critique or pile suspicion on suspicion is to redouble it, right? It's to catch ourselves mimicking in some ways the very move that we're trying to subdue, questioning messages that ask us to question more, claiming to have insights into the motives of those who claim to have insights into ours. The underlying logics of disinformatia, such as promoting divisions and authoritarianism in society, can remain essentially intact. And this, I think, complicates the whole class of responses to disinformation that focus on just giving people more tools to critique information. So I want to conclude right now by quickly sketching out a design direction that addresses disinformation in ways that go beyond the methods of critique. This direction involves testing out alternate ways of reading and thinking. It seeks to take the act of critiquing information, something we can never fully do away with, and trying to infuse it with habits of thought that go beyond suspicion. This direction draws on Felsky's turn to the post-critical and Latour's general call to the social sciences and humanities to develop methods of critique devoted not only to debunking, but also to, and I quote, to repair, take care, assemble, and stitch together. And this isn't intended to replace critique-based interventions so much as supplement them. By designing things that help us make wiser use of not just our conscious reasoning, but our emotional and social resources as well when we grapple with information. To bring this to life, let me share one or two examples really quick. I've been exploring this direction through student-centered research. And while I don't have any definitive conclusions, I've experienced these designs as promising because of the level of engagement. The designs are low fidelity prototypes, which is an intentional choice because it lets users feel more empowered around giving things like feedback. Here in this first example, you're seeing a Google document. 10 student researchers prototyped and tested an online tool to help users explore what it can be like to read and critique news in an alternative way, one that afforded more peer support and opportunities to practice slow thinking. They applied the Wizard of Oz method and used Google Documents to develop the prototype and tested it in 16 online conversations through a protocol that they had co-designed, where one person in the conversation was asking questions and the other was answering them. And this provided them a chance to scaffold each other in assessing how they read and critique the news. We also tried designing other forms of learning experiences. One design was about helping learners understand how their own emotional makeup and values trigger certain reading habits in them when they encounter information from repugnant cultural others, that is, sources they have deep moral differences with. Learners were asked to read a news item of their choice from a source that was repulsive and read it 3 times. And they were scaffolded to reflect on their flow of emotions as they did so. Again, I noticed high engagement. Each learner described that this activity was challenging, but also immensely rewarding because it helped them learn something about themselves. And this is like a nascent design direction that I'm excited to explore more. But for now, I'll simply point out here that these designs are not inviting people to engage in suspicion, but to do something else. So here are some things a post-critical design intervention might forego. Subjecting information or its source to interrogation, diagnosing its hidden motivations, categorizing it as accurate or inaccurate. And instead, this direction might help us with reflecting on what makes a certain line of reasoning attractive or repulsive to us, making sense of our reactions when an article we trusted is accused of being misleading, and more broadly, noticing the effects our information environment is having upon our mood. All right, so 40 minutes, we covered 2 case studies, 4 misconceptions, and 1 line of future inquiry. I'll summarize by saying that I believe that human flourishing requires contending with how our tools can facilitate disinformation, and that contending with disinformation will require maneuvering around technology, policy, and education in ways that don't just reaffirm existing arrangements, but also reimagine them. And I can keep talking about that all day, but if I did, we won't have time for your questions. So I'll thank you for your attention and do my best to answer some now. All right.
Thanks. That was impressive in terms of, being time bound and the depth of the research and how you presented it. So how do we proceed from now? Do you want me to share the Jamboard so that we see the questions on the screen here,
Yeah,
or do you want to just?
I'm happy to share my screen and go to the Jamboard.
Okay, I haven't really seen any questions in the chat. If I have pasted them into the Jamboard, so you should have everything there.
All right. Thank you all, by the way, for once again for your attention and all these questions. Just to confirm, Anna, can you confirm
Yeah, we see it. Yeah.
All right. I need just a moment.
Okay.
After that marathon, one, to refill my water, and two,
Definitely.
read.
Water is important, especially this time of the year.
Further reading on the topic, the title of the book, those are right there. Can we expect a solution to disinformation that would be user-friendly? Good UX, okay. These are great. As I understand, retweeting, quoting Russian sources and pointing to suspicious, unreliable accounts might be done to some degree automatically. Are Twitter and Facebook doing something like this, and how do you evaluate their efforts? Okay, yeah, Twitter zone. There's a Twitter zone. Is there any article website on your retweet network graph? Okay. And I just want to check. Okay, no one got to the comments board. That's fine. All right, yeah, so this is great. And by the way, you guys can keep adding more follow-up questions. You can also just do +1 on questions that you really want to hear me address, which is like he's not getting to that +1. Feel free to do that and add more questions as we have a conversation. I don't know if we can let people unmute and share their video. If that's possible, that would be great. So I'll just dive right in. Just one last thing. Would you say that this information is oh my, these are great. Thank you all. Okay, so easy ones first, right? What's the book mentioned that the book was Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway. Making kin, there's a subtext, making kin in the Cthulhu scene or something, but if you just Google Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, you'll get it. Further reading on the topic. Well, thankfully, there's a lot of research being done on this. It depends on where your interests lie. If there's a really good book by Thomas Rid called Active Measures, which gives a beautiful historical context to some of the stuff I've been talking about. Like he goes into the history of disinformation in a nuanced way. So Thomas Rid's book on active measures is one I would recommend. Then additional reading beyond, there are always lots of books, but I highly recommend the articles being put out by the Data and Society group. So if you just go to Data and Society, they have excellent articles about media literacy and about some of the tactics being used by disinformation campaigns. And they publish really beautiful reports for different kinds of practitioners. I highly recommend them. I think those are starting points. And if anyone wants more further targeted reading recommendations, you can reach out to me anytime. Happy to talk more. I teach this stuff so in my class, so happy to have more targeted recommendations. Jumping onto the diagonal here, would you say that disinformation associated with vaccines is based on urges to think critically? Yes, there's a lot of unfortunately, a lot of disinformation associated with vaccines, right? And so there's no one answer here. There are lots of different narratives, but consistently one theme has been, and in my work, for instance, I do cite some examples of this. Yes, there are a lot of groups which are anti-vaccination, and their position is not to don't take vaccines, but it's like, do your own research, think critically about big pharma and the medical industrial complex. Think about uncertainty in science. So a lot of disinformation is about around vaccine hesitancy, is around undermining trust in public information at the end of the day. And one of the levers for that is inviting people to engage in kind of critical thinking, over-interpreting little bits of information, right? And we see that in online discourse all the time, where people appropriate a comment made by a scientist and critically analyze it, looking for like hidden motivations or hidden causes and noxious motives. So yes, I would say there is this urge, the urge to think critically has influenced vaccine hesitancy. Beyond that, I don't know. Yeah, we can talk more about that, but that's my initial impression. I think it is an important part, like mistrust and how that influences this kind of hesitancy and critical thinking is an important area of study. Should we teach counteracting misinformation in schools, and in what manner? Right now, we are encouraged to teach critical thinking. And so great question. I think, yes, absolutely. We should be teaching people at all levels of society about this topic, and developing new literacies around this topic is essential in some ways to arrive at a more human-centered solution. So education has a crucial part to play here, I think, for us. And especially, yes, for younger adults who are often, what we would call digital natives. We need to be reaching them and helping them engage with this topic early. So I agree with that. And then the more important question is how, right? Which is what you're getting at here. First, I'll just say, like, I think folks in Europe are way ahead of us in the US. So in some ways, I should be asking you all this, like, yeah, how do we do it? Please help us, please teach us. So, I would say that upfront, but the one thing I would add is, like, it's not just about teaching people critical thinking, right? There are ways to, that is important, and we should not do away with it, but we should supplement it with, as I was saying, like, helping people think about their emotions as they're engaging with content. When do they take in the news? Like, help learners understand the effects their information environment is having upon their mood. So for instance, helping them notice, when do you actually read the news? What is the news to you? Helping learners construct their own insights around this topic, because for many of them, with the students I've worked with, the news means picking up your phone first thing in the morning after they wake up and scrolling their Twitter feed just to catch up. That's the news for them. And it's not for us to say, oh, that's bad or good, but to help them notice, okay, when you're doing that, is that the best time to be taking in the news for you? Like, and the answer might be yes for them, but helping them construct and author their own insights around, the impacts it's having on their attention. And so there's this kind of mindfulness around emotion and multitasking that we need to be cultivating. And just a broader, like, also another thing we need to be thinking about in terms of literacies is not just an emphasis on interpretation, but action. That is to say, often this information is about stoking hate and stuff, and our social media platforms have made it much more easy to interact with media content, including this information. So how do we teach people how to take positive social action around problematic information, correcting it, for example, when you see it online? How do you engage in constructive conversations or, behave responsibly in online settings? is another line. So it's in addition to interpretation, I think we need to be talking about action. And yeah, so those are just some quick thoughts. Happy to talk more about that, but I do want to. Oh, there's a comment. Thank you. I like the idea too, because I said it. I'm from the Wikimedia Poland, and we teach young students about reliable sources using the example of rules that we have in Wikipedia. I just want to riff on that comment a little bit, right? There is, I think that's exactly one of the directions we need to be going in the sense of teaching people, young and old learners about the different kinds of choices, like using norms and rules of healthier like information spaces. Wikipedia has some problems with this information, so I just want to go in that direction. It's not 100% immune or something, but as a platform, an information source, it remains much more resilient to intentional manipulation, researchers have found, and that is not for lack of effort. And there have been issues which I'm happy to touch on, but it's proven resilient in part because of this kind of community norm and standards, which deter like this kind of quick manipulation. It takes a lot more work to manipulate Wikipedia, and inviting students to think about why and how that works and what are the norms and lessons we can take from that. Because part of Wikipedia is it invites you to slow down, right? There are all these policies in place that kind of serve as speed bumps in our information consumption. So there's something there that we need to collectively study and design to bring into our educational spaces. Thank you. All right, I'm just gonna jump back and forth. Is there any article/website on your retweet network graph? The ones around the Black Lives Matter study? No, those were the dots were social media accounts. So the visualization you saw was not of articles and websites, but within the content, of course, people like tweets themselves, people were sharing articles and websites, and I did a lot of work analyzing those. And some of them, many of them were to legitimate news sources, but some were to, front websites set up by the agency themselves. And I have examples, but I cut some out in the interest of time and conversation. Happy to talk about those offline. How did you get access to Twitter data and that graph? So Twitter makes it possible to harness publicly available data. They have a public API, and researchers can collect online discourse. So this is not true for Facebook, but and Facebook platforms. But on Twitter, you can, as a programmer, just go and enter words that I want to just get all the tweets on this topic and start collecting forward in time anyone who mentions those words. So this was us building this data set. I was part of this lab of crisis informatics researchers. So we were collecting data related to shooting incidents, and that's how we collected that data. It feels like analyzing an awfully great amount of information. How did it feel to go through so many often hateful retweets? Thank you for asking that. That is a great question, and one that is of relevance to researchers, but also to all of us on some level. But like I'll say, it's similar to the problems faced by content moderators who have to wade through a lot of hateful narratives and other disturbing images and stuff. So this question connects to the plight of content moderators, the humans at these social media companies who are being forced to look at this stuff. It's also relevant to an increasing number of journalists who cover mis and disinformation, who have been describing feelings of burnout. I will say, so the volume of information, of course, creates feelings of overload, which one tries to manage using computational techniques. But going through the problematic content is something that first is like something I'm writing about. I hope to write a paper about, because more and more researchers are entering into this space and bringing graduate students and undergraduate students along with them into these spaces. we need to develop ethical norms and guidelines, or just have better strategies in place for emotional safety, because this was a problem in the research. So the Syrian Civil War study, there was an undergraduate, or there were several undergraduates in that study, and the way we managed that was, one, adopting existing principles from social science research on difficult topics. It involved us reading a lot about researcher reflexivity, about how content can affect researchers, and then having students engage in reflections with the researchers, the research team. We collectively engaged in reflections, writing about how the content was affecting us and having conversations about that, and pulling people out of the rabbit hole a little bit if it was happening. I sensed it was happening, but it was hard. It's not fun, I'll say that. It can feel like strapping a radio to the side of one's head that's blasting static. That is, over time, you're like, why am I doing this? And this is disorienting and depressing. I should stop, which is maybe kind of the point, but it's also healthy to disengage and take breaks. Thank you for that question. But yes, it's an emerging area of concern. People are trying to develop computational tools that can help content moderators engage with, even if we can reduce the time by like 1 second per tweet, that can make a difference to people's mental health. Yes, a hard problem. Can we expect a solution to disinformation that will be user-friendly? Well, that's a, so I come from UX, and I don't know, it depends on what you mean by user-friendly. I take it to mean tools that honor and respect people's agency and skills, rather than trying to automate them away. That's one definition of user or human-friendly. And I think that solution partially exists in education, developing better educational interventions. Educational interventions do not just have to be like purely in a classroom setting. They can be in sites of informal learning. So, for example, when Twitter discovered that these accounts were, in the Black Lives Matter study, when they discovered that these social media accounts are, associated with the agency, rather than just deleting this content, what they can do is develop tools to help those users who interacted with those agency accounts reflect on their social media activity. It was like, hey, we heard, sorry to tell you this, but you may have interacted with a Russian troll, and these are the ways you reflect. You interacted with them. Give them educational resources then. So that's one like user-friendly way we can start addressing this collectively. I don't think it's about labeling problematic information. It's about helping people reflect on it. And technology has an important part to play in that, because right now our tools are just about more, faster, better. But there's this room to also slow down around these issues. Did I hit everything? Anna, am I missing something? We're almost at time too,
I think,
right?
yeah, there's this question that doesn't fit into the sticky note. I'm not sure it was, or was it? If it was already referred to, then I'm sorry.
Well,
the one next
to
user experience. I think we have like 3 more minutes or 5.
Okay. Well, I mean, I want, if anyone has a last minute question, I'm happy to take those.
You can raise your hands and we can even unmute you if you wish.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any hands raised. There were also some comments in the chat that this is a great presentation, and it really was. I'm very happy that you could join us for today's, and that you could share your research. If you wish to share some, links to more further readings, I can then send it to our participants. If if yes, or if not, then thank you anyway for today, for your time and for your research, and for going through all those tweets, which we understand was pretty tough, I would say, and insightful research and perspective as we have in the chat. So thanks a lot and have a nice day, since it's only the beginning of the day in the US.
Yeah, thank you all. Take care.